There is a small city on the Mississippi River in northeast Missouri that has spent 150 years selling one of the most carefully edited versions of its own history in America. Every year, hundreds of thousands of tourists arrive in Hannibal, Missouri to walk the streets where Samuel Clemens grew up, visit the whitewashed fence and the boyhood home, and the cave and the statue of Tom and Huck on the hill above the river. They buy the books, they take the photographs, they leave with a picture of a sun-drenched, idyllic small town on the river, where America's greatest writer had an innocent, adventurous childhood that he eventually turned into immortal literature. What they do not always leave with is the complete picture, because the Hannibal that Samuel Clemens actually grew up in was a slave market town where 1 in 4 people was enslaved, where his own family owned and sold human beings, where he watched a man kill an enslaved worker at age 10 and face no punishment, and where the characters he immortalized in fiction had real lives that were nothing like their fictional counterparts. These are 37 facts about Hannibal, Missouri, that the tourism industry has not always been eager to tell you. Every one of them is real. Fact 1. When Samuel Clemens lived in Hannibal, 1 in 4 people in the town was enslaved. In 1850, approximately 25% of Hannibal's population was black, almost all of them enslaved. At any given time, up to a dozen slave traders operated in the town. Slaves were bought, sold, and shipped south from Hannibal to the Cotton Belt throughout Clemens' entire childhood. The town that Twain mythology presents as an idyllic American childhood was factually a functioning slave market. Fact 2. Mark Twain's family owned slaves. His father, John Marshall Clemens, was a lawyer, judge, and slaveholder. When John and his wife first married, they owned 6 enslaved people. As the family's finances declined, they sold the enslaved people to cover debts. When they moved to Hannibal in the 1830s, they brought 1 enslaved person with them. Twain grew up in a household where enslaved labor was considered normal property. Fact 3. At age 10, Samuel Clemens witnessed a man kill an enslaved worker. The man faced no legal consequence because Missouri law at the time held that killing an enslaved person was not a crime. They were property, not people. Twain wrote about it later. He saw his father beat enslaved workers, saw a minister tell the congregation that slavery was God's will, saw the violence of the system as a child, and accepted it as natural. The transformation that turned him into one of slavery's most articulate critics came later, after he left. Subscribe right now. Hit the button and the bell. Fact 4. The character of Jim in Huckleberry Finn was based on a real enslaved man named Daniel Quarles. Daniel was enslaved on Twain's uncle John Quarles' farm in Florida, Missouri, where the Clemens family spent summers. The real man who inspired one of American literature's most important characters, the first black character in American fiction to be portrayed as a fully human being, was eventually emancipated and died in Hannibal. His story is told at Jim's Journey, a museum in Hannibal dedicated to the African American history that the main tourist sites historically left out. Fact 5. The real Huck Finn was not a free-spirited boy having river adventures. He was a child named Tom Blankenship, the son of the town drunk, who was considered so poor and so far outside decent society that he had no obligations, no school, no supervision. Twain described him as the happiest person in Hannibal for exactly this reason. The adult Tom Blankenship moved west, became a justice of the peace in Montana, and died in relative obscurity. He never knew that his childhood self had become one of the most famous fictional characters in American literature. Fact 6. Huckleberry Finn was the first book officially banned in the United States immediately after publication. The Concord, Massachusetts Public Library banned it in 1885 within weeks of its release, calling it trash and suitable only for the slums. They objected to the slang and the low-class characters. The irony is that the later banning of the book, for its portrayal of race and its use of period-accurate racist language in service of an explicitly anti-racist narrative, would not have been the objection of the people who banned it first. Fact 7. Mark Twain served as a Confederate soldier for approximately 2 weeks. When the Civil War began, Clemens joined a ragtag Missouri militia unit called the Marion Rangers. He made several tactical errors. The unit nearly stumbled into a confrontation with Union forces, and he resigned. He left Missouri almost immediately for Nevada, where his brother Orion had been appointed secretary to the territorial governor by Lincoln. He spent the rest of the war in the West. He wrote about his brief Confederate service in an essay called The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, which is one of the more honest pieces of Civil War memoir in American literature. Fact 8. Mark Twain was not born in Hannibal. He was born in Florida, Missouri, a village 35 miles to the west, on November 30th, 1835. His family moved to Hannibal when he was 4 years old. Florida, Missouri, currently has a population of approximately 8 people. Much of the original village now sits beneath the waters of Mark Twain Lake, the reservoir created in the 1980s that flooded the area. The site of Twain's actual birthplace is partially underwater. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story matters. Fact 9. Mark Twain's real name was Samuel Langhorne Clemens. The pen name Mark Twain was a riverboat term. When a leadsman measured the water depth and called out Mark Twain, it meant the water was exactly 2 fathoms, 12 feet, which was the minimum safe depth for a riverboat to navigate. It was the signal that the river was navigable. Twain adopted it as a name that meant something specific about his time on the Mississippi. Fact 10. The Mark Twain Cave in Hannibal, the cave featured as McDougal's Cave in Tom Sawyer, contained a preserved human body for a period in the 1800s. A physician named Dr. Joseph Nash McDowell stored his dead daughter's body in a copper cylinder filled with alcohol inside the cave as a preservation experiment. Her body remained in the cave for an uncertain period before eventually being removed. The cave was already open for tourism during much of this time. Fact 11. Mark Twain went completely bankrupt at age 58. He had invested his entire fortune and a significant portion of his wife's inheritance in a mechanical typesetting machine called the Page Compositor, which he believed would revolutionize printing. The machine was brilliantly engineered, but too complicated to operate reliably. It failed commercially. The investment destroyed him financially. At the age of 58, with a wife and 3 daughters and a public reputation to maintain, Twain was insolvent. Fact 12. Twain repaid every single debt. After the bankruptcy, he went on a global lecture tour, 122 performances in 71 cities over the course of a year, specifically to earn enough money to pay back every creditor in full. Most people in similar positions paid creditors a fraction of what was owed and moved on. Twain insisted on paying the full amount. By 1898, at age 63, he had paid every debt. Fact 13. Twain predicted the exact date of his own death. He was born on November 30th, 1835, when Halley's Comet was at its closest approach to Earth. He wrote, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it." He died on April 21st, 1910. Halley's Comet made its closest approach to Earth on April 20th, 1910, one day before his death. Fact 14. Halley's Comet only appears approximately every 75 years. The probability that Twain would be born during one appearance and die during the next was not calculated in advance. It was simply what happened. Fact 15. Twain was close friends with Nikola Tesla and visited him regularly in his New York laboratory. He was an early adopter of the typewriter, the telephone, and other new technologies. He held patents on 3 inventions of his own. He invested heavily in emerging technology throughout his career. The typesetting machine was one of many bets on new technology, most of which did not pay off as spectacularly as the typewriter adoption did. Fact 16. Twain convinced Ulysses S. Grant to write his memoirs. Grant was dying of throat cancer and nearly bankrupt when Twain approached him with a publishing deal. Grant finished the manuscript 4 days before he died in 1885. The personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant became a bestseller, earned approximately $450,000 for Grant's family, the equivalent of several $1,000,000 today, and saved them from poverty. The book is still considered one of the finest military memoirs ever written. Fact 17. Twain appeared on stage at Carnegie Hall with Booker T. Washington at a fundraiser for the Tuskegee Institute. He appeared publicly with Frederick Douglass. He wrote extensively against racism, imperialism, and political corruption. The transformation from the boy who grew up in a slave market town to one of the most prominent American voices against racial and imperial injustice is one of the most dramatic intellectual evolutions in American literary history. Fact 18. Twain's favorite daughter, Susie, died of meningitis in 1896 at age 24, while Twain was on his global lecture tour. He was at sea when he received the news. He wrote that he believed her death was punishment for some unforgivable thing he had done. He never fully recovered from it. His wife Livy died in 1904. His daughter Jean died of an epileptic seizure on Christmas Eve 1909, just months before his own death. The final decade of Mark Twain's life was defined by grief, bankruptcy, and the loss of almost everyone he loved. Fact 19. The Hannibal that the tourists visit today was deliberately constructed. Within years of Twain's success with Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, the town began systematically building its identity around his childhood. Buildings were labeled with fictional characters' names. The cave became the Mark Twain Cave. Statues went up. The tourism economy organized around a version of Twain's childhood that emphasized the sunshine and the river adventures and the fence and the cave, and minimized the slave market, the poverty, the violence, and the version of the childhood that Twain himself described in his most honest writing. Fact 20. Twain's actual view of Hannibal was complicated. He wrote in his private notebooks that the town was a poor little shabby village. He returned only a handful of times after leaving at 18. The idyllic Hannibal of Tom Sawyer and the actual Hannibal of Samuel Clemens's childhood were always two different places, and Twain knew it. The town has spent 150 years celebrating the fictional version, while the real one sits in the historical record waiting for someone to read it. Fact 21. The Becky Thatcher in Tom Sawyer was based on a real girl named Laura Hawkins, who lived across the street from the Clemens family. Twain had a childhood crush on her. Laura Hawkins lived a full adult life in Hannibal, married a doctor, and died in 1928 at age 91. She outlived the fictional version of herself by decades and watched as tourists came to stand outside her childhood home. Fact 22. Hannibal had a free black community as well as an enslaved one. Free black residents operated businesses, attended churches, and built institutions in the same town where the slave market operated. Their story is almost entirely absent from the main Twain tourism infrastructure, and has been reconstructed primarily through the work of researchers at Jim's Journey and in academic history programs. The complete picture of Hannibal's black community, both free and enslaved, is still being written. Fact 23. The cave in Hannibal was known as McDowell's Cave during Twain's childhood, named for the physician who used it as a laboratory and storage facility. When tourism operators realized the connection to Twain's writing, it was renamed the Mark Twain Cave. The renaming happened after Twain became famous, not during his childhood. The cave as Twain experienced it and the cave as tourists visit it today are the same physical space, marketed under a name that was applied after the fact. Fact 24. Twain left Hannibal at age 18 and never lived there again. He spent his formative adult years as a printer, a riverboat pilot, a miner, a journalist, and a lecturer across the United States and eventually the world. Subscribe if you haven't, hit the bell, and drop a comment. Did you know about the slave market, the preserved body in the cave, the 2-week Confederate service? because Hannibal has been telling a partial story for 150 years, and the full version is more interesting in every direction. Thank you for watching. The truth doesn't shout, it waits for you to look closer.